What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. While most of you may have been, out enjoying the weekend with family and friends, we were doing what we love best, and that's watching football. That's right. We got a break from the tape this weekend, and we got to watch the NFL Combine, which now seems to be known as the Underwear Olympics. And we're here to break this down, what happened, who improved their stock, who hurt their stock, and who answered some much-needed questions. To do that, we brought in one of my favorites, the old boss man from Pro Football Focus, Jeff Ratcliffe. Jeff, I know that you and I both had a baby around the same time, and mine just turned one a short time ago. So I know we're going to both have our hands full in dad life, but how was the Ratcliffe household throughout the Combine weekend?
Pretty good, I suppose. It was a little concerning, nothing to do with the Combine, but we had what was supposed to be a rainstorm turn into like a crazy snowstorm that ended up knocking out power in a lot of places around the Philadelphia suburbs here, which I'm in the northern part of the Philly suburbs. Really, really wild stuff. And it just kind of makes you realize when we're just talking silly stuff about football, there are a lot of other important things out there, but at least the Combine was here to take our minds off of it this past weekend. Because like I said, it was nuts. I actually had to get up on a roof, which anybody who knows me, just hearing me say that is like, well, we know you do the home improvement stuff, but you're not much of a roof guy. So I had to get up there because there was a piece of flashing that came loose because the winds were so bad. We heard it sounded like somebody was banging like just gigantic pieces of metal outside of our house, and that's what it was. So yeah, I my life briefly flashed before my eyes.
Yeah, I would have been the same way. It's just like, I'm pretty sure that my neighbors pretty much think I don't do any housework because, during football season, I moved back to Illinois and I started doing some housework like right when I moved in. But after that, like for the football season, I was like not out there. So I don't think they know who I am. I don't think that they think I take care of my property. There's a lot of things that kind of go on, but it reminds me of like a couple of years back in Chicago. We had a snowstorm during the Super Bowl, and anybody that had Dish Network on my street was knocked out. So they came over to my house. We watched the game, had a good time, but it's definitely it's a struggle when you live in a place like Philadelphia or Chicago where you're getting that snow. And fortunately you were able to see the Combine, so let's talk about that. There was quite a few storylines. We're going to hit on a lot of those. I doubt we're going to have time to hit on any defensive players just because it's like we're trying to fit so much in this little show. But let's address the biggest topic before we get into specific players, Jeff, and that is, how much do measurables really matter? I mean, are you one that's going to use them over the film that we've watched? Or do you take an equal mix of the two, or is one more weighted in your analysis of the players?
Well, so my process really starts in January. We're talking about this right before the show, just to pull back the curtain for folks, though. Most folks who are in the industry in a position like you or I am in don't watch college football. And if you do watch college football, maybe you're single, or your significant other probably really hates you for 4 months. I get enough crap for, just spending an entire Thursday night and Sunday and Monday night watching football. I can't imagine adding Saturday into the mix. It's a lot of football. It is. So for a lot of us, we just can't do it until January. Once the playoffs hit, though, frees up a little bit of time. That's when I start going through players. And I'll just, I have a list. I'll go through the big names, of course. And some of the names you get to watch a little, from highlights and stuff like that during the course of the season. Mm-hmm. But then I go through that list and then really, really start to establish a profile on that player. See if he looks like anybody to me. And I really like to operate in a vacuum. I don't get on Twitter. I'm not on draft Twitter. I don't care what people have to say on draft Twitter. I mean, it's great that that's a conversation, but I don't want it to change my perspective on a player. Mm-hmm. So I do this in as much of a vacuum as I can, and then start to dig through the list a little bit, some of the deeper name players who still could potentially be fantasy relevant. That's most of January and February for me, right up to the Combine. And this week, I actually released my top 50 pre-Combine rankings the morning the Combine started, morning the event started, not the actual Combine itself, like the on-field events. So it came right down to the wire, right? And then once I get to the Combine, I want to see, all right, for example, like if we had like a 6'4" receiver, right? I know that guy's not going to run 4.40. And if he is, he's going like top 5 pick, right? He's not going to do that. But can he run 4.5? Can he run 4.52? Or is he going to run more like 4.6, right? That would separate things for me. If I see a guy go out there, run, for his height, run a fast time, then all right, maybe I move him up a little bit from where I was before on him. Same thing with the running backs, not necessarily the 40 times, although some of these 40 times, that I'm sure we'll talk about did move the needle for me, but I'm looking more for explosion with those guys. I want to see vert. I want to see broad jump. What kind of explosion do they have? And of course, can they operate in a phone booth with some of the other drills, the cone and the 20-yard shuttle. So it will change things a little bit for me, but it's not going to be drastic. I know a lot of people are into the metrics and into what these guys can run, but I've seen some. I mean, Antonio Brown is a great example. What did he run,
Yes.
like 4.54 or something like
Mhm.
that?
He's
Did
not an
that?
athlete. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
in the NFL sense, people don't think he's an athlete.
exactly. And did it ultimately really matter? Or some of these running backs who will go out and run 4.6s, like Arian Foster was a 4.6 guy.
Mhm.
That doesn't necessarily it's not all or nothing with any of these things. And the thing is, and we'll talk about, I'm sure, with Barkley, when the on-field is spectacular and the combine is spectacular, then you're looking at a really, really special player.
I love the way you put it too, and it really does matter on the player that you're talking about. Like Auden Tate, I don't think anybody expected him to run a 4.5 or a 4.40, but seeing him run up in the 4.7s, that was not ideal. So there's certain things when I take notes. Jeff mentioned we start our process in January and we start watching all this film on players, and there's certain players where I get to and I'm like, I put a little note and I say I want to see how he does this in the combine because I feel like it's a concern of mine. Or like Hayden Hurst, I didn't feel like he looked like he was 6'5" on film, so seeing him measure in little things like that interest me. But my biggest interest is watching them on the field playing next to the guys that they're being compared to. Because Jeff, as you mentioned it, draft Twitter, there's so many differing opinions when it comes to college football. Like when we get to the pros, everybody knows who the top tier wide receivers are. Like we know who Julio Jones is, we know who Antonio Brown is, we know they're the best receivers in the game. But that's why it's so interesting with college to me, is because it's a different ball game where it's like you have to figure out how their game is going to translate to the pros. Just because they got a ton of passes in college like Zay Jones, does it mean he's going to translate to the NFL? And is he going to be that possession receiver that he was in college? Landing spots absolutely matter. Players matter. Everything matters. So I love how you brought that up about, the different drills with the running backs doing the vertical and the broad jump. It just shows the burst. And we're going to talk about that stuff. But let's start with quarterbacks. And it feels like this might be a shorter portion of our episode. I don't think we need to talk too long. It feels like it's a very top heavy class with the quarterbacks. Let's start with the group one, because it was separated in two groups. It was Josh Allen. It was Lamar Jackson. Now, Jeff, I'm not sure where you stand on Josh Allen. I know he's got an arm that can throw the ball over mountains. He's Uncle Rico. He's all that. But I've always been the type where I feel like you cannot teach accuracy. We've never seen a quarterback come into the league and dramatically increase his accuracy percentage year over year. And, Josh Allen being able to complete 56% of his passes in college, I don't think that translates very well. But I will say this. He outplayed Lamar Jackson at the combine. Lamar Jackson looked like he was aiming the ball. It was like he was overthinking it. He wasn't just playing his game. We know he's got upside, but how do you feel right now about Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson?
Well, I think Lamar Jackson, obviously we hear the comps to Michael Vick all the time, and I feel like that was something we saw consistently out of Michael Vick. Had an arm, a crazy arm, but would aim quite often when he was asked to pass, except for that, really remarkable one season that he had in Philly. A lot of that was, very similar with Lamar Jackson. That being said, though, I still find a lot of appeal to Lamar Jackson for fantasy purposes, because he is like Michael Vick, because he is so dynamic as a runner, and does have enough chops as a quarterback that if you get him in the right scheme, we saw good coaching can cover up deficiencies in the quarterback game. Nick Foles is not the greatest quarterback in NFL history. Sorry, Eagles fans. That was a really smart game plan. They played to his strengths. Sean McVay did the same thing with Jared Goff. I think that Matt Nagy is going to do the same thing with Mitchell Trubisky this year. And if we get Lamar Jackson in a system where the coaches can play to his strengths, he could have success for fantasy purposes in the future. And I don't think it would take too long. Now, granted, he could land somewhere where they don't do that and he could fizzle out very quickly. Josh Allen, like you mentioned, though, accuracy, sure, that's a big problem there. He's in some ways this year's version of Patrick Mahomes without the resume. Mahomes at the college level, the resume was insane in terms of the production. That's what I mean, resume. I don't mean like, winning national championships or anything, but I don't really care about that for fantasy purposes. I like that Allen, the stage wasn't too big for him. He went out there with all the other best prospects, and he did a darn good job. So at least that bodes positively. But in my evaluation of Allen, I said that he's probably, well, I mean, of the top group, he's the biggest question mark in that he could very easily down the road be an elite fantasy option. He could very easily never be a fantasy option. Both of those are legitimately on the table, and I don't know if we can necessarily say that for the rest of these guys. So, I didn't end up changing my rankings after the combine with the quarterbacks, and it's an interesting class, like you said. It's top heavy, and it's a little challenging, but for me, I always tend to lean more towards those dual threat guys when it comes to fantasy rankings.
Yep, absolutely. And that's why I had Lamar Jackson higher than I did Josh Allen in my rankings. And I think that's without a doubt the way I would lean. If you were doing a dynasty startup draft right now before knowing a landing spot, I'd take Lamar Jackson over Josh Allen every single day of the week, just because I feel like Lamar Jackson's going to get an opportunity in the NFL and he's going to produce with those rushing numbers. It's just what happens. That's not the class that's not the tier of quarterbacks that I feel like has longevity. I think that the next group of quarterbacks, the Baker Mayfields, the Josh Rosens, and even the Mason Rudolphs, that's like the group that I couldn't wait to see. And, when Mayfield and Rosen were throwing the ball, I feel like they were head and shoulders above everybody else. They threw it some anticipation. Mayfield showed off some of his arm strength that a lot of people didn't believe that he had. So, did either of these guys move up or down your board? I know Mayfield had a disappointing 40 time, but he's still a very elusive player. He still looks to throw first. I was never one that thought Mayfield was going to be a run first quarterback. I never compared him to Johnny Manziel. I don't feel like that's a really fair comparison for him. I feel like he's my favorite quarterback in the draft. I'm not going to be shy about that. And nothing changed from the combine. But did him or Rosen do anything in the combine that made you feel better or worse about them?
Maybe a little worse about Rosen because he's supposed to be the quote unquote best thrower of the ball in this class, and I don't think we necessarily saw that per se. But the way that I sort of tiered this out is I actually do have Lamar Jackson ranked as my number one in this class for fantasy purposes. Okay. I don't want draft people to come after me for that because honestly, that's not my job. I'm not a draft Nick. I'm not a scout. I'm doing this for fantasy. Last year, it was the same exact reason why when I looked at it, I didn't necessarily have my board set up. I mean, the fourth quarterback who came off the board was pre-combine my number one quarterback. And obviously things didn't work out very well in Cleveland, but there were weeks where he put up some fantasy points, right? Mm-hmm. And it was the same exact reason why I like Lamar Jackson here. So that I have Darnold and Mayfield as that other top tier guys. Then I have Allen and Rosen as sort of the next tier below that. And then a big drop off really down to Rudolph and Falk and guys like that. But I love Baker Mayfield, the way that he plays the game. I love the moxie, the arm. He can sling the rock. And I was able to meet him right after the Heisman, and I was not surprised by the measurement. So I go about 6'2.5", and he was right up there with me. So I was expecting to see pretty much where he measured in terms of height. So he's not under 6 foot. That's fine. I think in some ways he could be a poor man's Drew Brees, the way that he plays the game for fantasy purposes. I don't think he'll be Drew Brees. Maybe we never see a guy that consistent for that long ever again. The numbers that Brees put up were really remarkable. And all you box score scouts out there, if you're listening to this and you're a box score scout, Drew Brees was freaking awesome this year. I don't care what the numbers say. He was awesome. And he's going to be a decent value next year. But yeah, Rosen, of these guys, any of the top four, Jackson, Darnold, Mayfield, Allen, for me, if 5-10 years from now, those guys, any one of them was an elite, number one, number two overall fantasy quarterback, number three overall fantasy quarterback, that wouldn't surprise me. I would be a little bit surprised with Rosen. I think he's more in he could be a back end quarterback one type territory than he could ever be an elite fantasy option.
Yeah, like a Matt Ryan. That's my comparison for Josh Rosen. I feel like that's why I feel like he's probably one of the safest quarterbacks to draft, and that's why I understand if the Browns wanted to go with Rosen at number one. Mayfield might come with a little more risk, even though he is my number one. Now, Jeff, I want to go back to you saying that Jackson's your number one fantasy quarterback. Now, that's the part where I think we have to figure out how much do we value longevity with quarterbacks? Because let's pretend, now I'm not disagreeing with you. If Lamar Jackson walks into the league as a starter, I'd have him as my number one fantasy option of these guys. Mayfield might be close because I think he's got sneaky rushing potential. But what about in dynasty formats where guys are looking to solidify that quarterback position? Would you still have Lamar Jackson number one, not knowing that he may not have the longevity of someone like a Josh Rosen or Baker Mayfield?
I would still have him there. Now, I also have to be pretty clear. I do prioritize quarterback in Dynasty. I like to keep cycling through, but when I build a dynasty roster, I'm probably going to draft 3 quarterbacks, maybe 4. It'll be every draft's different. It depends on how deep the rosters are as well. But I really want to be stable there, and I don't ever want to look down at my dynasty roster and realize that I have 3 quarterbacks and all of them are 33 years old or older. I want younger guys, so I'm always going to be cycling through. So typically, if I have Lamar Jackson ranked at number 1. I'm not drafting him in rookie drafts. That's just the way my drafts work out. So I probably will find myself with Baker Mayfield more often than not, or Sam Darnold, whoever falls and whoever's value. Because in the first round this year in rookie drafts, I don't and if you're talking number 1 quarterback, you may have to take him as early as the back end of the first round, probably more like the beginning of the second round. But I really want to be loading up on running backs this year. This is a great class for running backs. There's so much depth, so much value, so much versatility in this class that even ranking him there, I wouldn't draft him. So I guess I'm not really that concerned with the longevity thing. Even there, what's the shelf life on a quarterback like him? It's still significantly longer than and really most other positions.
It should be.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, I think this is a good spot to transition into running backs. I mean, we had some teams apparently asking if Lamar Jackson would run at wide receiver during the drills, and he said, no, I'm a quarterback. And I respect him for that. I think that's exactly how he should have handled it. You don't ask players to play a different position that they don't play. I mean, he's coming into the I feel like he's going to go in the first round, Lamar Jackson, just because of the upside that he presents. I feel like the Cardinals are a team that can kind of use that upside. Him and David Johnson in the backfield would be a nightmare on opposing defenses, even if they don't have the offensive line that they probably should have before they start, building that backfield. But let's move on to running backs. I don't know if we really need to say anything about Saquon Barkley. I mean, I think we all knew how good he was. I think we knew that he would dominate this combine. He was built for it. I mean, 99th percentile. But my question, Jeff, the only thing that I really want to know about Barkley is, do you really feel like he's going to go in the top 2 picks of this draft?
I don't know. It's a hard question. It's a really great question, in fact, because every year we see quarterbacks get overvalued in the draft because of the scarcity at the position. And the scarcity at running back isn't necessarily there. I mean, you look at last year, a day 2 pick was the rushing champ this year. I mean, granted, things kind of broke his way a little bit, or, kind of slightly backdoored that for Kareem Hunt, but still, you can get really strong productivity out of guys, even day 3 guys potentially in this era. So that hurts the cause a little bit. But in the same right, if you want to say you draft the top player at number 1 or number 2, it is clearly Saquon Barkley. There isn't a quarterback who is more impressive. I don't think there's a guy on the defensive side of the ball. Yes, some of these guys are quite impressive. Like Chubb is a specimen, but Barkley is more of a specimen. Barkley is a freak of nature. To be able to run that way at that size and do some of the intangibles. There's detractors out there. There are always detractors. Some people are saying that he bounces outside too often and he struggled against better competition. But in the same right, he has some of these intangibles, the knack for the movement at just the precise right time. Even when he doesn't see the defender, he feels the defender. It's really remarkable. And then the chops as a receiver. I mean, that's something, sometimes you get one, you get the other, but you rarely get both. And we see how great that is for fantasy purposes in Le'Veon and David Johnson. Barkley, I wish I could say yes, he's going, but it would not surprise me if the Browns didn't do that. Wouldn't surprise me if he doesn't go 2. Would it be surprising if he slips out of the top 5? Probably, yeah. But I think if the Browns are smart, hey, you have 2 picks in the top 5. You draft Barkley and then you draft a quarterback and you're good to go. But it's the NFL, so
but that's my question.
Logic doesn't always prevail.
Well, Jeff, I talked about it last week on the podcast. What do the Browns do with Duke Johnson then? Because Duke Johnson's a really good player, but I think we've already seen that Hugh Jackson doesn't want to put him on the field for more than 8 to 10 touches per week. What do they do with him at that point? Because Barkley walks in, he's a 3-down option. You really don't want to take him off the field if you're taking him at number 1 or number 4 overall. Do they trade Duke Johnson? Does he sit on the bench? What happens with Duke?
Well, Duke Johnson, if you want him 8 to 10 touches a game, that sounds like a darn good slot receiver to me.
They used him for week one, and then they slowly backed away from that stance. I mean, they should be in the market for a slot receiver. I mean, because you have Josh Gordon and Corey Coleman who don't really play the slot all that often. I don't think that they want to go back down the road of slot by committee, kind of what they were doing last year. So it'll be interesting. I just that's why for me, I feel like they could do better. I feel like they can get Fitzpatrick at 4. I think they should take their top quarterback at number 1, whether that be Rosen, Mayfield, Darnold. That some people, I mean. I don't know. I just think the Browns need some safe picks, and running back is not going to fix your franchise. That's where I'm at. The Giants, same thing with them. I can't see them going with Barkley just because they have so many needs on the offensive line. Eli Manning, he wasn't horrible last year. I think people kind of overblown that, but at the same time, he's aging. Davis Webb, we've never even seen him on the football field. I think they have so many questions. I think they need to build that offensive line. So I'm with you, Jeff. I wouldn't be shocked if he fell out of the top 5, and of course, Twitter would lose their friggin' minds. But that's just the way life is. One running back that really impressed me, and honestly, I have to reconsider moving him up my boards, and that was Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb ran a faster 40 than his teammate Sony Michel, and that's something I didn't see happening. I think on the field, Michel looked like the faster player. He's obviously the more NFL ready in terms of 3-down back, Sony Michel, because he's excellent in pass blocking. Nick Chubb is a 1-2 down back, but how did his combine, move his draft stock? Are you a Nick Chubb believer, or do you think that he's still a 1-2 down back, and that's very limiting, and that's why you shouldn't draft him in maybe the first 2 rounds?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Chubb is really intriguing just in general because we saw improvement after the injury. 2016 wasn't very impressive out of him, and then comes back in 2017 and puts up some solid production there. So I think that helps. It just we've been down this road so many times with 2-down backs. When you look at it for fantasy purposes, though, the Rob Kellys of the world, that type of player who and Chubb athletically is superior to Rob Kelly. I'm not saying that that's a comp, but for fantasy purposes, when the guy is touching the ball, hey, sometimes he could get 20 touches. Other times he can get 8 touches. It depends on the game script. I'd much rather have a guy who's on the field all 3 downs. So I still have him behind Michel. I have Chubb at number 5. I mean, Michel is at number 4. And then you have the big 3 that I think a lot of folks have as their top: Barkley, Geis, Jones. But regardless, that's the knock on it. I liked seeing what he was able to do at the combine. Showed strength, obviously, showed speed. But again, if he's not going to have a role in the passing game, then he really is landing spot dependent. And that's one of those things. It's a huge pet peeve of mine at this time, and I'm sure you get it on Twitter as well. If we talk about pre-draft rankings, people are like, well, it all changes after the draft. We don't know that, right? Whoa, really? Wait, their value changes after they get drafted? We get it, but we want to understand these guys. What do they look like on even turf? Everybody in a vacuum together, what do they look like? And Michel is a more intriguing player just because of what he adds in the passing game. So that's a big knock there. But hey, I liked what we saw out of him. I think it will help his draft stock for sure, to answer your original question with Chubb.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's the thing is I came into this, and you and I have the exact same rankings. It's Barkley, it's Geis, it's Jones, it's Michel. And then for that number 5 and 6 spot, it was down to Royce Freeman, Nick Chubb for me. Nick Chubb's combine might have put him a little over Freeman for me. And the thing is, Freeman's a similar back, that 1-2 down back that, he can catch a pass out of the backfield, but I don't think that's what he's going to be known for. I think he's competent. I think, but they're both very workhorse running backs. And landing spot absolutely matters. Where if Nick Chubb were to land on the Browns, it's a bad spot. Let's just be real about that. It's not a great spot for his fantasy value because that team's not going to be ahead to pound the rock 20 times a game. Whereas if he landed on a team like the Patriots, where he walks into that blunt role that we wanted, Mike Gillislee to have last year, he's all of a sudden he has tons of value. So landing spot absolutely matters. That's why putting together rankings before the draft for fantasy, it's a really tough thing for me to do. Darius Geis, I don't think we need to talk about him. The combine, it was what it was for him. I feel like he didn't hurt his stock. I don't think he helped it very much. I don't think he necessarily separated himself as a running back who should be considered in front of Barkley, like some people had suggested before the combine. One player that did look solid, and it's one that there's different points of view, and it's Rashad Penny. He looked good going through the drills, but here's my take on him, Jeff. Looking at the state of the NFL, where it's at, and how many running backs are available in the draft and free agency, I just don't see him being drafted as a starter in the NFL. Am I off on Penny, or do you view him as a starter?
I think he can be a starter. he's kind of the anti-Donnell Pumphrey. Both of these guys coming from the same school and the name often in same sentence, with both of those guys. But he's a bruiser. He could create on his own, had 80 forced missed tackles as a runner that led the nation last season. Now, of course, he's not playing some of the schedules that some of these guys like Sony Michel are playing, but regardless, still very productive. And have a source who knows San Diego State pretty well and said that he's the type of kid in the same way that Barkley's that type of kid too, where if you're finishing up your workout and he's done, he's going to come over and help you finish your workout. That's the same way that Rashad Penny is, so really dedicated to the game. And that's the type of player there who, if he gets that shot, if the stars align, he could be an immediate impact. You have it a little different. I go Chubb at 5, then I have Kerryon Johnson, Rashad Penny, then I have Freeman after that. So I know I'm a little high. Actually, you know what? I had Freeman behind Kalen Ballage as well, and I was actually happy to see that he did pretty well there with some of his testing. He didn't test off the charts and everything, but when you go out and you run 4.46, which was the third best time, along with Penny, by the way. Then it was pretty solid. So, yeah, I like Penny. I think he's going to be one of those guys, like I said, this is running back heavy where, maybe you look to trade up in rookie drafts to the early second round if you can, because you could really stockpile some talent this year.
Yeah, Kerryon Johnson's one of those players that I would love to get in a fantasy draft. I feel like he's someone, I have him ahead of Penny, and I feel like that because I feel like he's more 3-down ready. Kerryon Johnson, I mentioned it when we did the preview for the running back class this year, and I said he reminds me a little bit of Matt Forte, where it's like he's not great at anything, not like elite. I mean, Matt Forte was an elite pass catcher. I don't want to take that away from him. He might be a Hall of Famer one day. We don't know, but that's what Kerryon Johnson reminded me of a bit. Rashad Penny feels like he's got some work to do in terms of his pass protection. He looks very raw at times. I feel like with the ball in his hands, he's fantastic, but that's where I feel like I don't think he'll be drafted as a starter just because I don't know if he's better than 32 other running backs in this league and everybody available in free agency. There's just it's a very bad year to be a free agent quarterback. It's a bad year to be a free agent running back because teams are going young. But is there anybody else? I mean, Nyheim Hines, he ran a 4.38 second 40, but he's rough around the edges as a prospect. Did this move him up boards so much that we should be talking about him in fantasy circles?
No, he's a gadget player for me. I can't see him being used much. I mean, and by the way, Kerryon Johnson, I think Forte, that's interesting. I have a very similar player in Arian Foster, who I thought he was, sort of poor man's Arian Foster in a lot of ways. A glider, a guy who can catch the ball to the backfield. Some people are comping him to Tevin Coleman because of his upright style. I didn't see that as much, but I get it. I get when a player has that sort of that running style that's going to be an immediate comp in today's era. This class, I mean, Nyheim Hines, not really interested. I'm interested to see, what the market will ultimately be. If he's probably a day 3 pick, but on John Kelly out of Tennessee, he's kind of interesting. Bo Scarborough obviously is interesting, but 267 carries in college. I mean, that's nothing for a guy who is supposed to be this, physical freak. And then Mark Walton is another name. And I heard Daniel Jeremiah during the combine raving over him. Maybe if he had a full season this past year, we'd be talking about him a little bit more. So he's another sort of slightly under the radar name to just keep an eye on.
Yeah, Mark Walton was someone I was really looking forward to seeing at the Combine, obviously missing almost basically the entire 2017 season. I feel like he may not be in peak physical form yet. He was just cleared a couple weeks ago to perform at the Combine, so I want to see his results improve because he just didn't look like he had as much explosion as I thought he did going back to his 2016 tape, but you're right. He was at one point considered a better prospect. John Kelly, again, I wanted to see him stand out a little bit more at the Combine. He didn't. I think he's an awesome pass catcher. Ito Smith was someone who wasn't invited to the Combine, but I would have loved to have seen him there because I think he's a the third down running back that can come in and contribute right away. But yeah, as you mentioned, it's a pretty deep running back class. Once you get outside the top 6-7 names, you're looking at, team fits and who's going to fit in somewhere. So this is going to be my favorite part because we get to talk about the position that has the biggest differences in opinion. And of course, I'm talking about wide receivers. And Jeff, I mean, I kind of had enough with draft Twitter this weekend about Calvin Ridley because, this is where the conversation comes in. Like, what do you trust more? Do you trust your eyes, or do you trust the metrics in terms of broad jump, vertical jump, all that stuff? Because Calvin Ridley on tape, hands down, most NFL ready wide receiver in this draft. He's a technician in his routes. He may not be the crazy athlete that some, I don't know if they expected him to be. And some people are saying that it's not that Calvin Ridley can't be good, but he's not deserving of a first round pick, because nobody that posted his athleticism results is being drafted in the first round. And the ones that did were busts. You'd have to go back, and it's like you mentioned at the top of the show, and I'm really happy about that, about Antonio Brown, because my best comp for Ridley is like an Antonio Brown, Stephon Diggs type receiver. Matt Waldman was on our show saying that he's like a Marvin Harrison type receiver. So talking about a receiver like that comes with very little bust potential with the type of receiver he is, seeing these numbers have people freaking out all over. Antonio Brown did not nail the combine. In fact, I read Antonio Brown's his draft profile, like his scouting profile coming into the pros, and a lot of things are very similar between him and Calvin Ridley. What I wanted to say, Jeff, is that I really wanted to get the point across here is that when you heard Michael Irvin talking, so when you heard Steve Smith, these two Hall of Fame wide receivers talking about Calvin Ridley, they gushed about him, saying that he will be one of the elite wide receivers in this league once he figures out how to slow down, like to figure out his game speed, because he almost plays too fast at times. Where are you at on Calvin Ridley? And can we please stop the notion that there's guys that he should be dropped to the third round? Because this is what you're hearing out there. I'm not buying it. I still think Calvin Ridley is worth a top 15 pick in the NFL draft.
I think people just need to slow their roll a little bit. Probably the people who are saying that are the same people who were saying that Kareem Hunt was the worst football player in NFL history halfway through the season this year.
Dalvin Cook too.
Even though he was playing just fine, even though, Calvin Ridley had the production that he had in college in a run-heavy offense, by the way, and he was still able to stand out there. And you would have thought he ran like 4.7. I mean, the guy ran 4.43. Okay, it's not 4.30 or anything, or 4.22. But in the same right, he didn't run a terrible time. There are a couple other times, like I expect to see James Washington run a little bit faster than he ran. There are times there that stand out, both good and bad, of course, in this year's class. And I wasn't. It's one of those that isn't going to move the needle for me. That being said, this is not the best wide receiver class. He's the best of the bunch, but I'm not very excited about Ridley right now. Now, granted, he could land in a good spot. We saw this happen, this past year. Juju Smith-Schuster landed in pretty much one of the perfect spots for him, and it all clicked. So if Ridley lands in a spot like that, and the comps that we're making, I mean, when you comp a guy to Marvin Harrison,
yeah,
I mean, that is that's a lofty comparison.
It is.
When you read through some of these comps, like the Lance Zierlein comps on NFL.com, I always find them very interesting, because sometimes you read through and you're like, oh, wow, he comps to Zach Mettenberger or whatever. But then you read, Marvin Harrison. I think that's what Lance Zierlein has there. And then, of course, Saquon Barkley, he has Barry Sanders. I mean, those are really lofty comps. So it says something about Ridley. I mean, the two knocks that I have for him for fantasy purposes, and the one isn't even a huge knock because I don't put that much stock into it, is the drops issue, 23 drops on 335 targets at the college level. The other one is his age. I mean, he's going to be 23 years old in this season. I mean, he's essentially almost the same age as Amari Cooper. Mm-hmm. So two guys, one has 3 years under his belt. The other has no years under his belt at the NFL level, same age, basically. It's not good for dynasty in terms of his shelf life, but he's the best of the bunch for me.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is when we talked about him on our preview show, we talked about Ridley and the fact that, yes, he is older for a prospect, but at the same time, most wide receivers don't come into the NFL knowing the entire route tree the way he does, and that's why I'm okay with him being taken high in the draft. And again, I feel like he's a wide receiver that he's the anti-Courtland Sutton, where Sutton can come with so much bust potential, but we know he comes with massive upside, whereas Ridley, I feel like you know what you're getting, and so many people are knocking him down. They're saying that DJ Moore should be drafted in front of him. And I mean, while DJ Moore is a fine prospect, I think he's a good, solid, all-around player. I don't see what they're talking about. I mean, when you watched Ridley run the routes that he was running, even through the drills, the guy isn't doing just what they ask him. He's showing off in his drills, and Michael Irvin pointed all that out. It was fun watching him, and that's where it's just, to me, don't get freaked out about Calvin Ridley. I don't see any way he makes it past the Ravens. I've mocked him to the Bears at 8. I don't know if that happens. I think the Bears may end up trading back. I don't know if they should move back to the point where they're behind the Ravens, though, because I think the Ravens would take Ridley at 16 if he did fall there. So there's something to watch there, but I wanted to get that off my chest because too many people are knocking Ridley and saying that he belongs in the third round. And at that point, you have room for equity. No, he's a playmaker. You draft him. The standout at the combine, though, for me, it was Christian Kirk. In my mock draft a week ago, I had him going as a late second round pick. I felt like he could come in and fill a role for the Patriots. He could help them win now, help them replace, Danny Amendola, who's slated to be a free agent. Chris Hogan was dinged up late in the year. Julian Edelman, 32 years old, coming off a bad knee injury. That's where I had him. But now, seeing his fluid movements, his sure hands, the stability out of a slot receiver has him moving up. Now, the question is, Jeff, do you think that there's any chance Christian Kirk moves into the end of the first round?
I'd be a little bit surprised by that if he was a day one guy. It depends on who's drafting where and who's still on the board for these guys, obviously with anything, but that would surprise me to prioritize a slot receiver. That's why I am a little bit surprised that if this is true, there are this many suitors for Jarvis Landry. To lock up a long-term slot guy, it's not the biggest priority in the NFL. And then, also with Christian Kirk, I know a lot of folks look at the productivity of Texas A&M. They look at what he is, but they forget also what he is. He's a slot receiver for dynasty purposes. Do we really want a slot receiver? If you're in a PPR, I suppose, because Jarvis Landry in PPR has been one of the best performers over, his career here over that span of time. But I'm not very high on him. Like I have a bunch of these guys ahead of him. I have like St. Brown ahead of Christian Kirk. I have Moore ahead of him. I have Anthony Miller ahead of him. And maybe him and Miller, the gap closed a little bit because you have two slot receivers with Kirk and Miller. But either way, and not too excited. I don't think he goes first round, though. That would really surprise me.
Yeah, I would also like to see DJ Moore play a slot role in the NFL. I feel like he's the guy that's not afraid to go over the middle. Solid hands. He came in at 6 foot, which was actually taller than he was listed at. 210 pounds, ran a 4.4 240. So again, DJ Moore, while impressive, while watching on tape, there was some inconsistencies in his game. I'm not going to pretend that there's not. There was some inconsistency in his quarterback play, but you could say the same thing about a lot of other receivers. What do you feel about Courtland Sutton? Obviously, Jeff, we haven't had you on the show during the draft process, and there are a variety of opinions on Courtland Sutton. I felt like watching him at the combine, he looked a little bit clunky out there, not as smooth as other receivers, but, he's 6'3", 215 pounds. He did really well in the stuff that was kind of off the camera, the 3-cone drill, the shuttles. He did well. So if you're a team, at the end of the first round, do you take a shot on him?
See, he's a guy, that sometimes these teams fall in love with when you have the size that you cannot teach. And the 4.54, that's where I would want to see. I don't want to see much slower than that for him. The thing about him, though, is he brings some of these intangibles. He is pretty darn good downfield. He's not gonna blow the top off the defense, but he did well on deep ball targets last year. Caught 12 of them, 20 plus yards in the air out of 36 targets, which that may not sound like a lot, but that's basically one a game pretty much at the college level. That's pretty solid. Obviously play above the rim for red zone purposes, and pretty good after the catch. 26 forced missed tackles over the last 2 years, so it's solid numbers for him. And that's something I don't want to get too much into yards after catch. That's one of those metrics out there that people throw around, like with Moore, for example. That's a number that they're throwing around with Moore. What was it, 6.8 yards after catch?
It's a ridiculous number, yeah.
Which we had. I know there are different numbers at different sources. That's the PFF number. But regardless, one of the things that we will consistently see, like this is the old Mike Evans argument. Oh, he doesn't do anything after the catch. Yeah, that's because he's targeted like 80 yards downfield, right? The further downfield you are targeted, the lower your yak is going to be almost across the board. That's why somebody like Jarvis Landry, who gets targeted 5 yards in front of the line of scrimmage, is going to have a higher yak than Mike Evans. So I don't want to look at that per se, but he was surprisingly good for his size after catch. Sutton was, that is. I think he's intriguing. I don't know if he ever is a wide receiver one in fantasy, but I think he is going to be a fantasy producer on Sundays. Of course, the big thing with a lot of these quarterbacks is we know that quarterbacks are not immune to bad quarterback, or the wide receivers, that is, are not immune to bad quarterback play. So we need Sutton to land in an ideal spot. But back end of the first round, he very likely could.
Yeah, that's kind of where I see him going maybe top of the second.
Yeah.
One player I want to see end up with the Cowboys. I mean, James Washington, he's a name that rings a bell. And that's the thing. You mentioned his 40 time. I felt like it was 4.5. It's fine. What I see with Washington is he gets separation in his routes an awful lot. He creates separation for a guy that it's almost like a build-up speed that he seems to have, because he would catch a lot of the deep balls, but he was getting separation despite not having that twitchiness. But he seems to know how to run a route, and he impressed obviously at the Senior Bowl. He's someone that I would like to see the Cowboys maybe entertain at their number 19 pick, although I do think that they need to go defensive tackle there. But there's a lot of different ways we can go here. Antonio Callaway, he's a name I wanted to mention on the show just because I felt like he improved his stock. I don't know if he's ever going to be a fantasy football option, but he's someone who was away from the game for a year. A lot of questions surrounding him off the field, but he looked really smooth. I think one player, Jeff, I'm hoping, I would imagine that you saw the same thing. I felt like the loser of this combine was Jordan Lastly, UCLA. He had a horrid combine. He looked really bad. He ran a bad time, and in the gauntlet, he was double catching. He was dropping through the drills. He was dropping balls. Like Jordan Lastly, how much does this hurt his stock? I want to keep in mind it's just one bad day, but what does this do to his stock?
I think it reaffirms what we saw on tape with him, because he had 11 drops last year. So. If you want to see a guy kind of shore that up, and especially like I said with I mentioned earlier with Josh Allen, I don't want the spotlight to be too big for these guys at this event, and it seemed like maybe it was for him. He didn't step up there. And you're right, of anybody at this combine at the wide receiver position, he may have been the one who needed the best combine too to improve his stock, and he did have one of the poorer performances at the wide receiver position. So for him, I looked at him as maybe a third round rookie pick. He's going to drop a little bit because those concerns are probably just they're just too much to overcome. I actually had him a few ticks ahead of DJ Chark, who I'm going to move up now. I was on the fence with him. We saw he was so good downfield, caught 14 of 28 targets, 20 plus yards in the air, 572 yards on those targets, straight line speed. And we know the NFL loves speed. And when you go out there and you run sub 4.4, it's pretty impressive. So another LSU receiver to the NFL level, and I think he will make a little bit of a difference here. Now, not a guy who we look at as a long-term wide receiver 1 or anything, but wide receiver 3s, they have value too. Wide receiver 2s, they have value, and with his speed, and again, in the right system, but with his speed, he could be a difference maker.
All right, so before we move on to tight end, Jeff, you mentioned it. Equanimeous St. Brown, you said you have him high in your rankings. Let's talk about him. What did you think about his combine? Obviously, he ran under 4.5. He was in the 4.48 official time, 6'5", 214 pounds. What do we feel like his upside is? Like, do you have a comp for Equanimeous St. Brown? I screw that name up one more time.
Yeah, it is a really, really tricky name to say there. For him, I was very impressed with the 40 time. When you're at that height, anything sub 4.5 is rock solid. Now he's lean. Yeah. Comp wise, I don't know if I have necessarily a really good one. I know some of the names that have been thrown around. Again, I always mention Lance Zierlein because he does every player, and I don't know how he has enough time to do all that. But Andre Holmes, he threw out there that's not really the best comp when you look at it for fantasy purposes. But in the same right, he has more upside than that. And then the other thing too, the 20 reps on the bench, I think that's something we're hearing more and more and more about, contested catches. It's something that our team at PFF has been looking into, and you see it in a lot of our evaluations of these players. When you're strong like that, you can play above the rim. Not only that, but make the contested catches. That's a good thing for red zone presence. Plus, you would expect that because his dad was a bodybuilder, so you would expect that from him. I'm high on him because of the height. Really, the height you can't teach. And when I look at these guys, I sort of prioritize, running back, I prioritize 3 down guys. At quarterback, I prioritize dual threat guys. At wide receiver, I prioritize guys who could be a prototype wide receiver 1. Now, that doesn't mean top 12 fantasy receiver. It means big-bodied X receiver at the NFL level. And he could be that. He has some developing to do. We've seen some of this with some of these guys from Notre Dame recently, but he could be that here. And I was glad to see him go out and do a good job at the combine.
He definitely had a good combine, and that's the thing. One of my comps when I was watching him, I felt like a little bit Malcolm Floyd to him. I don't know if it's just the tall, lanky guy, but that's the thing is I feel like there's more upside. I feel like he's bigger than Brown was, but it depends on the landing spot. Obviously, all that stuff comes into play. You want a quarterback who's got an arm to get him the ball. But is there anybody else at the wide receiver position that we missed that maybe you're like, I walked away from the combine really upset or really happy about?
I think Deion Kane did a decent job. He's a polarizing guy for sure. Some people love him. Some people absolutely hate him. But, he went out and ran a good 40 time 4.43. Is he one of the good Clemson receivers to make it to the NFL level, or is he one of the guys who sort of fades? That's a good question with him, and I don't have an answer at this point. Michael Gallup is another name that I don't think he improved or fell off, but he's a really good football player.
Yes.
And if he would have had better SAT scores, maybe he ends up as in a Power 5 school. And maybe we talk about him a little bit more right now, but he has the chops to potentially be a fantasy factor as well. Out of CSU Rams right there for Michael Gallup. I like the way he plays football.
I have Gallup as my number 4 wide receiver, so you will not find someone who's higher on Michael Gallup than I. But one name I wanted to mention for you before we move on to tight ends is Jaleel Scott. I think he's an interesting project. I feel like he's a guy that moves extremely well for his size. Like usually when you find guys that are 6'5", 215 pounds, they're a little bit odd in the way that they move. I feel like he looks like a natural athlete, and he moves that way. In the combine, he didn't necessarily stand out in any of the things, but he's someone that I feel like on day 3 taking a shot, or even as an undrafted free agent, I don't know if he's going to fall out of the draft, but is someone that I feel like he's a raw prospect that you mentioned it, having that potential number 1 receiver. Scott is very raw, but he's got the body for it. I feel like he has the athleticism too. Have you watched any tape on Jaleel Scott?
He's on my list. I couldn't get far enough down that list, but yeah, he's got some buzz now. And the thing about him with the combine is the numbers sort of across the board are kind of mid-range, but that's fine. You don't want to see extremes on the low end. I mean, of course you want to see extremes on the high end, but you don't want to see any extremes on the low end. He didn't really do that, so he went out and did a decent enough job. I don't think he's a day 2 pick based on what I know from him right now, more of a day 3 pick, but there are guys, who last year we thought the same thing of, they're day 3 guys, they won't be much, and they ended up surfacing on the radar this year, maybe not the fantasy radar, but the NFL radar, and getting meaningful snaps at the wide receiver position. So that's an interesting name, a good call out.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's something to pay attention to as we get later in the draft, because some of those names will eventually turn into something. It's a name to keep on your radar is all. In terms of the tight ends, it's another class where it's like, for fantasy purposes, we want to talk about the pass catching receivers, like the pass catching tight ends, like Mark Andrews, Dallas Goedert. That's the thing. This class, I feel like there's 4 names that I think people were throwing in the top 4, and I think that they could have been rearranged in any order, and I would have had no issue with it because tight end can be really hit or miss in terms of, how can they stay on the field? How is their blocking? Mark Andrews, we know, didn't block very much at Oklahoma, so is he going to be on the field? Is a team going to draft him as almost like that hybrid wide receiver tight end? That's the questions that come up, but Penn State tight end Mike Gesicki, he essentially did what Saquon Barkley did, but at the tight end position in terms of his measurables and his athleticism. Is he now the first tight end off the board? I mean, after Dallas Goedert didn't partake in the combine?
Yeah, I still think it's going to be Goddard. I mean, the way that the kid plays, he's an animal, and Gesicki has some deficiencies in his game. It's a weird class because I get really excited about this class because of what you mentioned. If you like move tight ends, this is the class. Like move tight end / H-back, this is awesome. Goddard, Andrews, Gesicki, Hurst. Yes. And then we could even go down further. There are other guys in this class who, Akins, for example, who didn't run, he didn't run the 40 or anything like that. Didn't do anything actually at the combine, but there are really intriguing names here. I don't think he's the first one off the board though. I still think it's going to be Goddard, but maybe we now see these guys go a little bit higher than we had initially thought. But hey, we know for a fact tight end is really brutal for fantasy purposes.
Yes.
It's terrible. It is straight terrible. Lack of consistency. This year, I would have had better luck because it really was luck this year, ranking by just picking names out of a hat. I feel like just put the top 25 in a hat, and then whatever order they come out, I'll put them because every week, you kind of it's wise to play fantasy season long conservatively. Like you rank conservatively, and that usually evens out at the end of the season. But this season, it just made no sense. And the lack of depth, like you think there's depth, but there really isn't at the tight end position. So to have more of these move guys who can come in and ultimately for fantasy purposes, hey, draftnicks out there can say these guys can't block. I don't care. I honestly, Jimmy Graham thing. Oh, he can't block. Okay, cool. When's the last time he caught a pass when he was blocking? Like, I don't care. So yeah, to have Goddard, to have Andrews, that's the order I have it. I have Goddard, Andrews, Gesicki, and Hurst, and it's super close. The only knock I would have on Hurst is that he's old for the position. But they're all very, very, very similar guys. Andrews was a wide receiver basically at Oklahoma. Goddard, did Goddard beat up on inferior competition? Probably. But in the same right, could he go out there and play well against better competition? I think he can. And we did at least see, 23 reps on the bench was solid out of him. Gesicki jumping out the gym, the basketball background, all of these guys with the, athletic backgrounds that they have. And then Hurst as well, just freakishly athletic. I don't think the pitching background is going to do much for him as a tight end, but still, they're really appealing. This is an interesting year for these move tight ends. Now, that being said, I'm geeking out about it now. I don't know if any of these guys have a year one impact.
Correct.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But it's a long shot, right? To do what Evan Ingram did, that's kind of historic in a lot of ways. It's very rare to see these guys, and that's why it does tick me off when people call Eric Ebron a bust. Eric Ebron still isn't even close to the wheelhouse peak age for tight end production. Correct. He's still got 2 more years to go before we get there.
He's just turned 25, right? Like 25 years old this year, right?
Yeah, and 27 is the peak years. Look at we saw. Okay, Kyle Rudolph broke out, 27. Zach Ertz broke out. He's 26 last year, 27 this year. Mm-hmm. It's not brain. I always say it's not rocket surgery. it's pretty simple stuff. The tight end has a long learning curve for these guys at the pro level. At the college level, they can run around and just be athletic, but at the pro level, that just doesn't work. You have to learn a lot of things. So it's intriguing, but to ultimately answer your question, I don't know. I don't know if Gesicki goes in the first round. I do still think Goddard's going to be the first off the board, though.
Yeah, that's very likely. And that's the thing. Hurst is probably, honestly, if they were all the same age, I might say Hurst might be my number one tight end. He looks like a natural football player. Like you watched him out there in the drills. He was head and shoulders. He just looked so natural tracking the ball over his shoulder. He just moves very smoothly. He was given handoffs while playing in South Carolina. He looks so fast on tape. So I was a little disappointed by his 4.67 40 time. He did come in at 6'4", so he was a little shorter than listed at 6'5". But he moves incredibly well for a tight end. So I'm really interested in landing spots for those guys. But as you mentioned, I think this is an important thing for dynasty football players. Where, Jeff, would you slot tight ends in terms of draft? Because last year we had, David Njoku, we had OJ Howard, sitting there, Evan Ingram, these guys sitting there that were being taken at the end of the first round. I feel like right now in the offseason, you can get, if you wait at tight end and say, I'm not going to draft a tight end, I'll trade for one after their first season or two, like David Njoku, you could probably get him right now for, an early second round pick, maybe a late first, just depending on your league mates and how they feel. But I feel like his value didn't skyrocket. I feel like people are around the draft are so geeked out on potential value that they'll sell a player like David Njoku looking for someone to contribute right away. So how early would you even consider taking a tight end? Maybe like Dallas Goedert, where would you take them in your dynasty rookie draft?
So as of right now, I have him mid-second round, and then I don't have another tight end until Andrews comes in the mid-third round. Yep. So, that's, and I'd say late middle second round for Goddard. I don't really want to prioritize it, even though I like these guys. You're right; you can get them for value. If there's a tight end, if I have a need a tight end and it's a third round, and hopefully I already had 3 picks by that point, then yeah, I'd probably be looking at one of these guys for value if they're still on the board. Even Hurst, even though the age thing isn't ideal, I don't really have a huge issue with that. But I think that's a tremendous point there at the tight end position in dynasty leagues. They lose value, there's that hype in the beginning, then they'll lose value because almost every tight end in their rookie season disappoints fantasy people. And then you can get them on the cheap, and you get them on the cheap. You sit on them realizing, it's the saying that all those people out there in crypto have: just hold the guy, just hold him, hold, listen to Braveheart, right? Hold. Yep. And wait, and then it's eventually going to happen if you believe in the talent that the guy has. Of course, nothing's 100% of the time, but yeah, I think that's a good move. And then the other important takeaway here is that there's a sort of influence that happens, the dynasty influence on redraft, and then people start, last year I kept saying, like, you're crazy if you're drafting OJ Howard. Yep. Like, you're crazy. Yep. You are absolutely off your rocker if you're drafting him. And, other than a few big, random, unpredictable games, that was pretty much spot on. We didn't want OJ Howard. It was too inconsistent. I would rather have, certainly would have rather went another route in that part of a draft. So just something to consider. I would not look at these guys as redraft options unless, like I said, maybe if Andrews lands sort of just in the perfect spot, there's no receivers, he's going to get a lot of targets and he's going to be the automatic number one at the position. But that, the stars are going to have to align for that to happen.
I agree. And I think the one spot where I would feel confident about that would be the Saints, because the Saints, they don't have a second. Do they have a third round pick? I know they don't have a second round pick, so they have to hit on that first round. So if they take one of those tight ends at the end of the first round, you know that they're going to contribute right away, because Drew Brees, let's be real here, 39 years old. The clock is ticking. They know that. The Saints obviously have to get a deal done. Otherwise, Brees ain't going to be back there. I want to, they have to get him franchise tagged within a few days. Otherwise, he's going to count as like a cap hit regardless, like a big, massive cap hit, something about his contract. So I don't know what's happening with Drew Brees and why they haven't gotten a contract in place with him, but I fully expect it to happen. How would you feel? Now, that's the thing. Let's pretend that Andrews or Goddard, one of those goes to the Saints at the end of the first round. Would those guys then be considered someone that you would contemplate at the end of the first round in a dynasty draft?
Yeah, that would probably move it up. Well, only slightly, though. That's the problem, because it's how many years of Brees do you have? Right. Do you have 2 more good years of Brees? And it happens quick with quarterbacks. Some of these guys, Peyton Manning, Brett Favre, they just fell off a cliff. Yeah. And there was almost no warning, So Brees, like I said, coming off another good season, even though the numbers weren't there. But how many years do you have? And then who's after Brees?
Right.
It's really rare to be lucky enough to actually have a franchise quarterback follow up a franchise quarterback. So that's I don't know if I would move him that much. I may move him to the front end of the second round. It's another really interesting question with Goddard. But you have to figure if they draft him, they are getting him in, and he's going to see plenty of targets in that rookie season. Yep,
that's exactly how I feel. Man, this is fun, Jeff. I always enjoy talking football with you. Obviously, you and I are in the same exact path here in terms of, where we're at in the NFL season, getting to jump on this tape, watching as much as we can over the last couple months. So it's fun. It was fun talking with you, man.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure, my man. Definitely love talking football at this time of year, because people always say there's an off season, but the beauty to football now, there is no off season. And what's even better is best ball leagues have made this fantasy's like 365 now, which is so cool. And it's great. It's sort of the beginning of the madness. We're just starting to put that whole puzzle together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Best ball leagues are so much fun. We're doing a lot of those at draft this offseason. We have a promo on our site. Go check it out. But as always, thank you guys for listening. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to follow Jeff's work, go check him out at profootballfocus.com. Follow him on Twitter at Jeff Ratcliffe. As usual, you could follow me at Mike Tagliere NFL. You are not going to want to miss tomorrow's episode as we welcome Mike Wright from Fantasy Footballers to discuss who is about to hit free agency, as well as their potential landing spots. Today, we heard that Jimmy Graham might receive some interest from the Saints. But again, guys, thank you for listening. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Until then, lights out.
I just wanted you to watch me dissolve.